Today's video will be a little different. We'll discuss something I would have liked to know about prior to taking a Trimix class. This is meant for those who already hold an entry-level technical diver certification, such as TDI's Advanced Nitrox and Decompression Procedures, or PADI's Tech 40, and are considering taking more advanced courses involving mixed gases in the foreseeable future. For those who are not technical divers, or divers for that matter, I included a link in the description to Jonathan Bird's video on the basics of Trimix, or just enjoy the fish. Our objective here is to answer the question, how is Dalton's law applied in Trimix diving? More specifically, how do we use Dalton's law to determine the required amount of helium for the dive we are planning? Please note, I am not an instructor, and this video should not replace formal technical diving education with a qualified technical diving instructor. Right, let's start with what was taught in entry-level technical diving courses, Dalton's law, or the law of partial pressure. To review, this law states that, in a mixture of non-reactive gases, the total pressure exerted by the gas mixture is the sum of the partial pressures of the component gases. To solve for the partial pressure of a component gas, we were given an equation involving three variables: partial pressure, fraction of gas, and depth expressed as atmospheres absolute, or ATA. The way my A&DP instructor taught me this equation was by using Dalton's triangle. Others might call it the circle T. On top of the triangle is partial pressure P. On the lower left side is the fraction of gas, F sub G. On the lower right side is depth expressed as ATA. The way this triangle works is that 2 out of the 3 variables must be known to solve for one unknown variable. Therefore, if P is unknown, multiply F sub G and depth expressed as ATA. If F sub G is unknown, divide P by depth expressed as ATA. If depth is unknown, divide P by F sub G and convert it to meters or freedoms. In entry-level technical diving calculations, we are primarily concerned with only one gas, O2. At this level of training, it is O2 that sets the MOD, and therefore, we were taught how to apply Dalton's law with O2 as the component gas. We might have been taught how to apply Dalton's law with nitrogen as a component gas, but it really would not have been of much value at that level because we could not do anything to change the amount of nitrogen once the O2 requirement was determined. Up to this point, everything should have been a refresher. You might be wondering then, where's the helium? My friends, this is where the fun begins. The following steps are an oversimplified version of what you will eventually learn in your Trimix course. Again, none of this is meant to replace formal technical diver training with a qualified instructor. Now on to Trimix. There is no direct way to solve for the helium requirement in Trimix diving. To solve for the helium requirement of a Trimix dive, we must solve for both the fraction of O2 and fraction of nitrogen, as these two gases determine the limit of our planned dive. We already know how to calculate the fraction of O2 using Dalton's triangle, or whatever you were taught, given the planned MOD. We will apply the same formula to calculate the fraction of nitrogen, and this is determined by the equivalent narcotic depth, or END. Very briefly, END is the amount of narcosis you can expect to experience with your bottom gas at your planned MOD as if you were breathing air. Once both the fraction of O2 and fraction of nitrogen are determined, solving for helium will be pretty straightforward. We will get to this shortly, but before that, we need to discuss END a bit further. I prefer to have my END between 30 meters, or 100 liberties, and 35 meters, or 116 democracies. In other words, I want my bottom gas to feel like I am breathing air between 30 and 35 meters. This is because I am already aware of the effects of narcosis at these depths. My specific preference is an END of 30 meters. Under certain conditions which are beyond the scope of this video, I may choose an END of up to 35 meters. In my humble opinion, the only good reason you might want to consider an END deeper than 35 meters is because you can still adequately respond to emergency situations with that level of narcosis. It is understandable that the cost of helium might come into question for some divers, which may lead to considering a deeper END to save on helium costs. But one does not simply go open circuit trimix diving to save on helium. We will return to Dalton's triangle to solve for the partial pressure of nitrogen at 30 meters and 35 meters on air, and Poseidon help you if you have forgotten how to convert depth in whatever units you use to ATA. Alright, calculators at the ready. To solve for the partial pressure of nitrogen at 30 meters on air, we multiply the fraction of nitrogen in air by 30 meters expressed as ATA. 0.79 times 4, which is 3.16. To solve for the partial pressure of nitrogen at 35 meters on air, we multiply 0.79 by 4.5, which is 3.555. We now have two partial pressures of nitrogen, 3.16 and 3.555. If you can tolerate an END of 30 meters for your planned dive, you can consider 3.16 as your partial pressure of nitrogen. If you can tolerate an END of up to 35 meters for your planned dive, a partial pressure of nitrogen up to 3.555 can be considered. If you can tolerate a deeper END, by all means, solve for a higher partial pressure of nitrogen. At this point, it must be reiterated that this is simply a mathematical model. There are other factors to consider when choosing an END you can tolerate for a specific dive, and therefore, the choice of END must not be taken impulsively. To add another layer of conservatism, you may even want to consider a partial pressure of nitrogen less than 3.16 for your planned dive. This is especially true for our friends on CCRs. With all this in mind, we are now ready to solve for helium. Let's have two examples. Number 1. We want to dive a deep reef with an MOD of 60 meters or 200 footlongs, and we can tolerate an END of 35 meters. Solving for our required fraction of O2 involves dividing our working PPO2 of 1.4 by our planned depth of 60 meters expressed as 7 ATA. And we get 0.2. To add a layer of conservatism, I will want to have 19% O2 in my bottom gas. Solving for our required fraction of nitrogen involves dividing our desired partial pressure of nitrogen determined by our tolerable END of 35 meters, which is 3.555, by our planned depth of 60 meters expressed as 7 ATA. And we get 0.508. To add a layer of conservatism, I will want to have 50% nitrogen in my bottom gas. In both cases, I've added my own layers of conservatism, and this is all for my own peace of mind. The actual MOD of the bottom gas is now slightly deeper than the planned MOD. The actual END of the bottom gas is now slightly shallower than the planned END. Now that we know our O2 and nitrogen requirements, we will simply deduct 19% and 50% from 100% to determine our helium requirement, and we get 31%. We now have our Trimix blend of 1931, with 19 being our O2 component and 31 our helium component. Number 2. We want to dive a shipwreck at 70 meters or about 4/5 of a football field, and we can tolerate an END of 30 meters. Solving for our required fraction of O2 involves dividing our working PPO2 of 1.4 by our planned depth of 70 meters expressed as 8 ATA. And we get 0.175. To add a layer of conservatism, I will want to have 17% O2 in my bottom gas. Solving for the required fraction of nitrogen involves dividing our desired partial pressure of nitrogen, determined by our tolerable END of 30 meters, which is 3.16, by our planned depth of 70 meters, expressed as 8 ATA. And we get 0.395. To add a layer of conservatism, I will want to have 39% nitrogen in my bottom gas. Now that we know our O2 and nitrogen requirements, we will simply deduct 17% and 39% from 100% to determine our helium requirement, and we get 44%. Now we have our Trimix blend of 1744. Behold, brides of Christ, we have successfully applied Dalton's law to determine our helium requirements. Helium is indeed a problem in terms of both cost and scarcity, despite being the second most abundant element in the universe after hydrogen. But these should all be trivial matters if you do intend to pursue technical diver training. As we all probably know by now, the first casualty in our beloved hobby is always the bank account. Initially, it was the additional gear, and now it is the gas. And it will be the gear again once rebreathers come into play. If you made it this far, well done.